Hi friends, I hope all is well. Recently I've been using store-bought sketchbooks in my videos, but in my off-camera art practice, I'm still using altered sketchbooks, specifically children's board books, hardcover books, and magazines. In this video, I'll show you how I prep each one. The next video, I'll show you how I use each one in my art practice. Let's start with the board book. I use board books in a few different ways. For this one, I reinforced the spine on the inside and outside and painted the cover. I started working in it 6 years ago. It was meant to be a dedicated art journal, and while it's taken me a while to find my flow with it, I pulled it back out this year to finally finish a few more spreads. Another way I use board books is for book arts, meaning I take a design concept and interpret it for the entire book, like this one. For this project, I removed the pages from the spine, decorated each one, then bound them back together using the tab binding method. I won't be making one of these today, but let me know in the comments if you're interested in a dedicated video on this process. For this video, I'm taking this board book and showing you how I prep it to use as an everyday sketchbook. I don't always decorate the covers of altered sketchbooks, but I'll show you how I decorate this board book so you can see how I do it. The spine is very thin on this book, so I won't be able to write the dates on it. I'm taking this matte black acrylic paint to paint the thin spine and about 1 inch on either side of it. This area is where I'll write the dates. While the black paint dries, I brought out my scraps container to use these papers to decorate the front and back covers. I usually don't put too much thought into the design because it's a sketchbook. You can certainly decorate the covers however you would like. I'm using fluid matte medium as the glue, but any adhesive will work. If you're using a glue stick, make sure it's extra strength. Also, you don't need to prime the surface. Here's the finished cover with only the start year on both sides. I put the year on both sides of the sketchbook that doesn't have a large spine, so when the sketchbook is in a bookcase, it's easy to see the dates when I slightly pull it out. Also, I'm starting not to put the month with the year because I don't think it's necessary, but that's my preference. I don't prep the pages ahead of time in this type of altered sketchbook because I only prep pages when I apply paint first. I'll go over that step in the next video where I work in each altered sketchbook. Next, I'll go over how I prep a hardcover book. Before I start altering a hardcover book like this one, I always check to make sure it isn't valuable. I also look for books with sewn signatures rather than glued ones because it makes it easier to remove the pages from the text block. I usually take out a few pages throughout the book to help it lay flat while I'm working in it. It also prevents the finished sketchbook from getting too bulky once I start adding layers of paint and paper. As you can see with this finished one, it isn't too bulky. I've heard artists call it gator mouth when the foredge is wider than the width of the spine. Try to avoid that look. I like the original cover of this book, so I left it as is. However, I usually paint the spine so I have a good spot to write the start and end dates of the sketchbook. This is the book that I've chosen for this tutorial. I'm keeping the cover for now, but I'm painting the spine with matte black acrylic paint so I can write the dates on it. Once that's dry, I'll start removing some of the pages. The spine has clear tape on it. I'm applying gesso first so the black paint will adhere to the spine. Once the black paint is dry, I write the start year with a white paint pen. This book is on the thinner side, so I won't take out too many pages. I look for the area where the binding thread is visible. That's the easiest place to remove the pages without damaging the rest of the book. I grasp both pages on either side of the thread with my right hand, then slowly tear it out. I use my left hand to steady the book and put my finger on the binding thread so it won't be pulled out. If pieces of the removed pages remain along the thread, I'll use tweezers to remove it. I check how the book looks after removing the pages. See how the foredge is narrower than the spine? This is how the book should look before you start working in it. I typically don't glue pages together if they're thin, but you could do that step if you prefer. With all the collage papers and paint that I apply to a page, it makes the page thicker. Also, I typically put paper behind the page I'm working on in case paint or liquid glue seeps through so the pages don't stick together. Next up, I'll show you how I prep magazines. Back in 2017, I went through a creative slump. To work through it, I started using this magazine as a sketchbook, mostly because it was inexpensive and it felt low pressure. I've since taken it apart to use some of the spreads in other collages, but it served its purpose at the time. I documented the process on my blog, so I'll link the first post in the description box if you're interested in reading the backstory. Using a magazine as a sketchbook is a great way to experiment and play without fear, and it's low pressure. You can use a magazine as it is, though I suggest removing a few pages like we did with the hardcover book to help it lay flat. Lately, I started elevating my magazine sketchbooks by binding them like a traditional book. This is a recent one I've made, and I want to show you how to make one for yourself. I picked up these magazines at my local library's bookshop for 25 cents each. I specifically look for magazines with heavyweight paper like National Geographic. Buying a few at a time is helpful because it gives you options for which pages to include in your sketchbook. Besides the magazines, let's go over the other supplies. To keep costs low, you only need a few basic supplies that you may already have on hand. For thread, you can use bookbinding thread, but I'm using upholstery thread for this tutorial. It's low cost and easily accessible. I personally prefer a curved needle because it makes the binding process easier, but a standard straight needle works just as well, and it's something most of us already have. We'll use a strip of fabric to cover the stitching on the spine. I cut this piece 7 inches by 3 inches because I'm folding the pages lengthwise. The spine matches the original width of the magazine, which is 7 inches. I went with 3 inches wide just to be on the safe side. Since I'm not sure how many pages I'll end up with, I would rather have the fabric too large and cut it down than too small and have to recut it. Any sturdy liquid glue will work to bond the fabric to the spine. I'm using Mod Podge for this sketchbook. If you have a bone folder or similar smoothing tool, it's great for getting crisp folds. If you don't have one, your fingers will work just as well. Finally, you may need an X-Acto knife, a cutting mat, and a ruler to remove the covers and pages, and for any necessary trimming. First, try removing the covers and pages by slowly tearing outwards with one hand and using the other to hold the magazine. I remove all the pages in order, even if I'm not going to use all of them. I find that when I tear pages in order, I'm more likely to get pages with clean, torn edges. If that method doesn't work, say if the magazine has staples, which some older magazines have, then use a ruler and X-Acto knife to cut the covers and pages. Fortunately, the covers and pages came out easily with minimal to no jagged edges. I deconstructed 3 magazines, so I had a good selection of covers and pages to choose from. Here are the front and back covers that I'm using. I'll switch the positions after I finish folding all the papers. The glass cover will be the front and the Cleopatra cover will be the back because I like the colors and image of the glass cover better. I decided on 5 signatures, each with 5 folios. If these terms are new to you, a folio is a single piece of paper that's folded. A signature is a group of folios. I prefer to fold every piece I'm using before trimming. This way I can see how the completed sketchbook will look and if it's necessary to trim or not. Also, I can use the cover or signature as a guide to cut the others to the same size. While I'm folding the folios, I decide on the order of each one. I may like the image that covers the whole folio, so that one can be used as a center spread. When I tore the covers from the magazine, part of the spine paper was still attached. I cut this section off each cover for a cleaner look. I measure the cut front cover against the back cover to make sure I cut off the same amount, so both covers will be the same size. Then I cut each signature so they're the same size as the covers. Now that the covers and signatures are cut to size, it's time to puncture the binding holes. I'm not too concerned about having the holes exactly spaced because this is a low-pressure sketchbook. Also, the spine will be covered so the thread won't be seen from the outside. One measurement that I think is essential is the outermost holes. It's best to have the top hole at least ½ an inch from the top edge and the bottom hole at least ½ an inch from the bottom edge. These binding holes will help stabilize the covers and signatures. These measurements are the first ones I mark using a ruler. You can mark the measurements with a pencil or pen before puncturing the holes, but I'm comfortable doing it with the needle. Then moving the ruler so the 0 lines up with the 1/2 inch hole and measure 2 inches inward. Then move the ruler so the top hole lines up with the 6 inch mark, then puncture the hole at the 4 inch mark. I'm using the cover with the binding holes as the guide for making the holes in the signatures and the other cover. Place the cover on top of the signature and make sure the folds line up, then using the needle to make the holes. It might be a bit harder to puncture the holes through the thickness of the 5 layers of paper. I didn't suggest a hole punch tool because I wanted to keep this tutorial budget friendly. Remember to place the signature down in the same orientation as it was before you made the holes. Continue doing this process until all the signatures and the other cover has holes. Do a quick check to make sure the holes are lining up before binding the sketchbook. Full disclosure, this is the second time I've filmed this section of the video. It was hard to see the upholstery thread binding on the video. Even though I highly recommend using it to bind a book, I'm using thicker bookbinding thread for this tutorial, so it's easy to see the stitching. I measure the amount of thread by holding it against the length of the spine and adding about an inch or so, then multiply it by the number of signatures, which is 5, and covers, which is 2. So you want the thread to be 7 times this length. I like to err on the side of having too long of a piece of thread than too short. I prefer not to tie off the thread mid-binding to add more thread. When I use upholstery thread, I double the length for double threading because it strengthens the stitching. I was taught to bind a book starting from the back cover towards the front cover. There are numerous reasons why, besides traditionally this is how books are bound. My reason is that I find it easier to bind signatures in this order. The binding I'm using isn't one of the traditional binding methods. It's a combination of a few. I find that it holds the covers and signatures in place. Also, we'll be covering the exposed spine with fabric, so it doesn't have to be a traditional binding method. I'm starting by stitching the cover with a 4-hole pamphlet stitch, going into the 1/2 inch hole from the bottom and leaving a 2 to 3 inch tail. This is needed to knot the thread after it's wound up and down the holes in the back cover. I like to hold the tail as I'm binding with my non-stitching hand. Weave the thread in and out of the holes. Once you come to the top hole, start weaving the thread back in the opposite direction, making sure the thread is tight against the fold. I'm not speeding up this section of the video so you can see what I'm doing. Then tie a double knot to secure the thread. Fold the back cover, then bring over the signature. I checked to make sure the holes line up before stitching the two together, just in case it wasn't in the correct orientation. Take the thread and insert it into the corresponding hole in the signature as the one in the back cover. Make sure the signature is lined up with the back cover and pull the thread tight. From inside the signature, weave the thread into the next hole. Next, we're going to secure the signature to the back cover by placing the thread behind the horizontal thread to the right. Then wrap it around and place it under the horizontal thread on the left side. Then go through the same hole, making sure not to puncture the thread that was coming out of the hole. Continue to the next hole and do the same stitch. For the last stitch in the last hole, go through to the outside, then weave the thread behind the horizontal thread on the right side. Then bring over the next signature, line up the holes, then take the thread and go into the corresponding hole. Do the same stitching method for the next hole until you get to the end hole. The remaining signatures are stitched in a slightly different way. Then bring over the next signature, line up the holes, then take the thread and go into the corresponding hole. Then go out the next hole. Instead of looping behind the horizontal threads, take the needle and thread and go behind the thread connecting the previous signature and the back cover together. This is where a curved needle is helpful, but I wanted to show how it's done with a straight needle. Pull the thread tight, then go back into the same hole. Do the same stitching method for the next hole until you get to the end hole. After you pull the thread under the stitch, then bring over the next signature and put the thread into the corresponding hole and continue the stitching method, except put the stitch under the two previous signatures connecting thread. With each added signature, the thread is stitched behind the previous two signatures connecting thread. Once the last signature is stitched, bring over the front cover and place it on top. Then bind it in the same way as the signatures. Go into the corresponding hole, then out the next hole. Going behind the thread connecting the two previous signatures, continue until the thread goes out the last hole. For the final stitch, pull the thread under the two signatures connecting thread and tie a knot by placing the needle into the loop and pull tight. I like to make a few knots to secure the thread. Then trim off the excess thread. The final step is to glue the fabric to the spine. I like adding fabric to the spine because it gives the sketchbook a finished look. Also, it covers the stitching visible on the spine that may not be technically perfect. I know by looking at the finished sketchbook that the spine is a lot less than 3 inches. A quick measurement shows that it's 1/2 inch. It's up to you how much fabric you want on the front and back covers. Because I like the images on the covers, I'm only having the fabric covered about 1/2 inch on each. I'm cutting the fabric in half from 3 inches to 1.5 inches. I brought out a rotary cutter to get a quick exact cut, but scissors will work just as well. After it's cut, I double check the length of the fabric and it's slightly long. Instead of 7 inches, the length of the sketchbook is 6 7/8, so I trim the fabric to match. I like to make sure the loose thread tails are against the spine before attaching the fabric. It helps to hide those threads. I center the spine of the sketchbook on the fabric and apply the glue on the sections that will be against the front and back covers. I avoid applying the glue to the fabric that will be touching the spine. Having the fabric unglued in this area allows the sketchbook to lay flat. Let the glue dry completely before using the sketchbook. So that's how I prepped these 3 different types of sketchbooks. The magazine binding is a bit more involved, but you can always find a simpler binding method, or just use the magazine as it is. Just remember to remove some of the pages to help it lay flat so it's easier to work in. Look out for my next video where I show how I work in each altered sketchbook. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching. Take care.